This video explains the work from Chapter 5, Section B, on the midpoint formula. The midpoint formula is a formula to help you calculate, well, it's obvious, right? The midpoint of a line. A midpoint means the middle. So in this diagram here, I can find the middle graphically by just finding the middle of the line and saying the midpoint of this line is going to be 1, 2, 3, 4. And in the y direction, 1, 2, 3 up. So before I can call this a coordinate system, I should label my axes. So we're going to go x in this direction and y in this direction. So the midpoint of A and B is 4, 3. But I'd like to develop a formula that allows me to calculate the midpoint if I'm just given the points like this without drawing the diagram. So let's see what we can find out about this. If I make a triangle and split up this line into its x and y parts, so here's its y part, that's the vertical part, and here's the x part, then I can also see that my midpoint is the midpoint of each of these lines. If I draw a line horizontally over to the side of the triangle and draw a line vertically down to the bottom of the triangle, then I also see that this is the middle of the y section and this is the middle of the x section. And the x section is 4 right here as well as there, and the y part is 3 here as well as there. So we can actually split up the coordinates for the midpoint into finding the average of these two coordinates in the y direction and the average of these two coordinates in the x direction. So the formula becomes the x point of the one coordinate plus the x point of the second coordinate divided by 2. It's finding the average of these 2 points to find this point in the middle. Let me simply put a comma to show that I'm making coordinate brackets here, and do the same thing for the y coordinates. The first y point and plus the second y point, again divided by 2, and end of brackets. So if I were going to do that for this problem instead of drawing it, I would first need to know which points I was talking about. So let's write down point A is 1, 2. And point B, if that's 4, is 5, 6, 7 in the x direction, and 1, 2, 3, 4 in the y direction. So let's just take those 2 points without looking at the diagram, use the formula, and see if we can get the same answer of 4 and 3. So start with my big brackets. I take x1, well that's 1. And x2 is over here, it's 7, and divide that by 2. Just like with the distance formula, you might find it helpful to label the points before you start with x, y, x, y, like we did before. So this point is x1, y1, because it's the first point, the x value, the first point, the y value, and this is the second point, so it's x2, y2. And then you won't get any numbers mixed up if you have it written down right on top of the numbers. So here I have my first y point, that is 2. And my second y point is 4. And I'm going to divide that by 2. And now I do the math, adding and dividing. So 1 plus 7 is 8. 8 divided by 2 is 4. And 2 plus 4 is 6. 6 divided by 2 is 3. So that's the midpoint I get using the formula, and you can see it's exactly the same as the midpoint that I found graphically just by eyeing it. I'm going to do another example. This example is a little bit more difficult because it has negative signs, and you'll see it's also going to have a non-integer coordinate. These are both integers, but sometimes you get midpoints that are not integers. But let's still follow the formula. I'll start by labeling the points with their names. So point 1 gets x1 and y1, and point 2 gets x2, y2. And now I start with the formula. x1 plus x2, negative 3 plus 5 divided by 2. And y1 plus y2 is going to be y plus a negative 2. That's the same as subtracting, but maybe it's helpful to draw it like that right now. And then that's all in brackets because I'm going right into the coordinate point. And now I can write the answers. Negative 3 plus 5 is positive 2. Positive 2 divided by 2 is 1. So the x-coordinate is 1. Here I have 1 plus a negative 2. That's like 1 minus 2. So it's negative 1. And negative 1 divided by 2 is negative 1/2. When you're dividing by 2, you could end up with fractions that have halves in them. And that's perfectly fine. You can leave it like that. Could put it as a decimal, but in mathematics we often leave things as fractions. So this is 1 negative 1/2. If you look at the points, you may be able to see that that's a reasonable answer by thinking about where negative 3 in the x direction is. That's over here. And 5 is way over here. So the middle is going to be somewhere just to the right of the y-axis. So 1 is okay. And y1 is 1 here and negative 2 here. So yeah, it makes sense that the midpoint is right there at negative 1/2. Okay, the only other thing that gets a little bit more complicated in this section is that sometimes you're given the midpoint and asked to find one of the coordinates. So in this example on the right, it says if T is the midpoint of PQ, so this point here is actually the answer already. It is the midpoint of PQ. Then we're asked to find the coordinates of P in the line PQ for this midpoint and this other point. So I have some line PQ, let's just draw it for a moment. There's P, there's Q, and here's the midpoint T. So I'm going to set up the formula with what I know. P doesn't have any value, so let's call P, the things we're looking for, let's call the coordinates of P just x and y. And now if I'm going to label the points, I have to be a little careful. Which one do I want to be point 1 and which one should be point 2? Since I'm adding in the formula here, it doesn't actually matter. So let's call P1 point 1. So let's call P point 1, so that's x1, y1. And Q is x2, y2. Okay, ready to start with what we know. We don't know x1, so that's going to be an x. And we're going to add it to 5, which is the x2. And that's divided by 2. Put a comma and in brackets. And then I have y1, which is just y, plus a negative 3 for the second y point, all over 2. And that's the end of brackets. So far I can't do anything with that, but I know that the answer is going to be 2, negative 1. So I actually have two separate equations here. This part has to equal 2, and this part has to equal negative 1. So if we write them out separately, x plus 5 divided by 2 has to equal 2, and y minus 3, adding a negative into subtraction, has to equal negative 1. I can solve these algebraically to figure out the answer. So first step here is multiply both sides by 2, and then I get the simpler equation x plus 5 equals 4. Basically putting that onto the other side. And now we subtract 5 from both. And I have x plus 0 equals negative 1. So x is equal to negative 1. Do the same thing over here, multiply both sides by 2. It's better if I show what I'm doing. Here I could have wrote times 2. So multiply both sides by 2, that cancels with this 2, and I've just got y minus 3. Negative 1 times 2 is negative 2. And then I add 3 to both sides and get y equals 1. So my final answer for point P is the x-coordinate is -1 and the y-coordinate is +1. And that is the correct point for P if this is the midpoint and that is the other point. This is where P has to be to make that happen. Okay, that's it. You're ready to start with the exercise.